The blood always pooled in the same spot, 20 feet down from the mine entrance where the mountain pressed closest to the earth. Every Monday morning for 16 years, Ezra Blevins would find it there, dark, thick, already drawing flies in the humid Kentucky air. The miners called it the devil's debt, payment for coal torn from sacred ground. But they were wrong about who collected it. The debt wasn't owed to some distant darkness below. It belonged to the man who stood above them every dawn, counting heads like a shepherd counts sheep, deciding which lamb wouldn't make it home. Ezra Blevins owned every soul in Blackrock Hollow, from the company store to the company graveyard. His grandfather had carved this coal camp from wilderness in 1878, and 3 generations of Blevins men had fed it with more than just coal dust and sweat. They fed it blood, deliberately and systematically, because Ezra believed the mountain spirits demanded sacrifice for every ton of black gold pulled from their sacred veins. What happened in Blackrock Hollow between 1922 and 1938 wasn't just corporate cruelty. It was ritualized murder disguised as industrial accidents, sanctified by a family convinced they were shepherds of an ancient contract. The mist clung to Blackrock Hollow like a shroud on the morning of June 15, 1922, carrying the smell of sulfur and something metallic that made children hold their breath when they walked past the mine entrance. Ezra Blevins stood on his porch overlooking the camp, watching 43 men trudge toward the mountain's black mouth. He knew each face, each family, each debt owed to the company store. More importantly, he knew which man wouldn't be coming home. Thomas Garrett walked with the easy stride of a man who'd survived 8 years underground. At 32, he was young enough to work the deepest shafts, yet old enough to know when the mountain felt hungry. Today felt different. The timbers groaned with unusual urgency, and the canaries in their cages fluttered with nervous energy that made experienced miners pause. But Thomas had a wife expecting their 3rd child and a store credit running dangerously high. He couldn't afford to turn back. Ezra's grandfather, Josiah Blevins, had built Blackrock around a simple philosophy. The mountain gave only what it was given. For every blessing pulled from the earth, something of equal value had to return. Josiah had started small: chickens, pigs, the occasional goat slaughtered at the mine entrance before major excavations. But as the operation grew and the coal seams deepened, so did the mountain's appetite. By the time Ezra's father, Malcolm, took control in 1900, livestock wasn't enough. The mountain knows the difference between animal blood and human blood, Malcolm had told his son. One feeds the earth, the other feeds the spirit that guards it. The first accident had been almost elegant in its simplicity. A support beam that developed a hairline crack exactly where the company geologists said it would hold for another decade. A roof collapse that claimed just one man, a troublemaker who'd been talking about organizing the miners into some kind of union. The timing was perfect, the cause was natural, and the mountain's hunger was satisfied for another 6 months. Ezra learned to read the signs his grandfather had taught him. The way water seeped from certain rock formations, the sound coal made when the mountain grew restless, the color of the mist that rose from the deepest shafts. Most importantly, he learned to choose the right offering. Thomas Garrett didn't know any of this as he picked up his pickaxe and headed into Shaft 7. He didn't know that Ezra had been watching him for weeks, noting his movements, his relationships, his value to the community. What made Thomas perfect wasn't his expendability. It was his importance. The mountain demanded quality. The explosion came at 10:28 a.m., exactly when the dynamite charges were scheduled to clear the new seam in Shaft 7. Every miner knew the timing, every family counted the seconds between the blast and the all-clear whistle. This time, the whistle never came. Ezra was in the company office when the mountain shook, reviewing ledgers that showed Blackrock's production trailing behind the other camps in the region. His brother, Caleb, burst through the door with ash on his clothes and panic in his eyes. "Collapse in 7, Caleb said. Thomas Garrett's crew was closest to the charges. "How many?" Ezra asked, though he already knew the answer. "Just Thomas. The others were pulling back when the ceiling came down." Ezra nodded and returned to his ledgers. Perfect timing, perfect execution, perfect sacrifice. The mountain had been fed, and production could continue for another season. But Caleb remained in the doorway, shifting his weight like a man carrying uncomfortable questions. "You want to say something?" Ezra asked without looking up. "The charges were set for 10:30. Thomas was supposed to be clear by then. Mountain doesn't follow our schedules. The fuse was shortened. I checked after. Someone cut it down to give less warning time." Ezra finally looked at his brother. Caleb was 5 years younger and had never fully embraced the family's covenant with the mountain spirits. He understood the necessity of accidents, but balked at their orchestration. This tension had been building for months as production pressures increased and the mountain's appetite grew stronger. "You suggesting someone wanted that collapse to happen exactly when it did?" "I'm suggesting we've been playing God with people's lives, and maybe it's time to stop." The silence stretched between them like a fuse waiting for a spark. Through the office window, they could hear the rescue crews organizing, wives gathering, children crying for fathers who might never emerge from the black depths. These sounds had become background music in Blackrock Hollow, as regular as shift whistles and company store bells. "Grandfather Josiah pulled 9 million tons of coal from this mountain," Ezra said finally. "Father Malcolm pulled 12 million. You know how many cave-ins they had that weren't planned? How many gas explosions that caught them by surprise? How many miners died when the mountain decided to take its payment without warning?" Caleb didn't answer because he knew the stories. Random disasters that claimed dozens at a time. Shaft collapses that buried entire crews. Explosions that left widows and orphans with no company support, because the deaths were ruled acts of God rather than industrial accidents. One man, chosen carefully, taken cleanly, keeps the mountain satisfied for months, Ezra continued. "It's not murder, Caleb. It's management." That afternoon, the company held a memorial service for Thomas Garrett. His wife, Sarah, received a death benefit of $200 and free housing until the baby was born. The other miners received assurance that new safety measures would prevent such accidents in the future. And Ezra made note in his private journal, "Mountain fed, production secure through harvest season." Blackrock's chapel sat at the hollow's heart, like a wooden witness to 6 decades of buried secrets. Every Sunday, 3 generations of Blevins men had occupied the front pew while miners and their families filled the rows behind them. Heads bowed in worship that mixed Christian prayers with older fears. Reverend Lucas Hartwell had ministered to this congregation for 12 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of death that marked the seasons. "We gather today to remember Thomas Garrett," Hartwell said on the Sunday following the collapse, his voice carrying across pews packed with faces that had learned to mask their suspicions. "A man taken too soon, a husband and father whose light was extinguished by forces beyond our understanding. Beyond understanding." The phrase hung in the air like incense, covering the smell of doubt that had been growing stronger with each passing year. How many accidents could one mine suffer? How many widows could one community support? How many times could grief be explained away as God's will or the mountain's hunger? Sarah Garrett sat in the third row, her belly round with the child Thomas would never meet. Around her clustered the other widows, Mary Hutchins, whose husband died in a gas explosion the previous autumn, Elizabeth Cole, who lost her man to a runaway coal car the spring before, Agnes Murphy, whose husband fell down a shaft under circumstances no one discussed in detail. 4 women under 30, 4 families broken by the mountain's appetite. In the front pew, Ezra Blevins bowed his head in prayer, but his eyes remained open, watching the congregation through lowered lashes. He noted which men avoided eye contact, which families whispered among themselves, which children seemed to understand more than they should about their father's daily danger. Knowledge was power in Blackrock Hollow, and Ezra maintained his control by knowing exactly who knew what. After the service, families gathered outside the chapel in small clusters, their conversations carefully neutral. No one spoke directly about patterns or suspicions, but the silence itself carried weight. Margaret Whitman, the school teacher who'd arrived from Lexington the previous year, stood apart from the mining families, her educated eyes taking in details that local residents had learned not to see. "Terrible thing about Thomas," she said to Sarah Garrett, her voice pitched low enough that others had to strain to hear. "Such an experienced miner. I'm surprised he was so close to the blast zone." "Thomas knew those shafts better than anyone," Sarah replied, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "He'd never have made that kind of mistake." The conversation might have continued, might have grown into something dangerous for the Blevins family's carefully maintained narrative, but Caleb appeared at Margaret's elbow with the practiced smile of a company representative. "Miss Whitman, I hope you're finding everything you need at the boarding house. We want our teacher to feel welcome in Blackrock." The words were polite, but the message was clear. Teachers who asked too many questions might find their contracts terminated at the end of the term. Margaret smiled back, equally polite, equally understanding. "Of course. Everyone's been very kind. I'm just trying to understand the community better, so I can serve the children more effectively." "Children do best when they focus on their lessons," Caleb replied. "Mining is dangerous work, Miss Whitman. Always has been. Always will be. The families here have learned to accept that reality." As the crowd dispersed, Ezra remained on the chapel steps, watching his brother escort the schoolteacher toward the boarding house. Caleb's doubts were becoming more visible, his questions more frequent. That worried Ezra almost as much as outside interference. The family's covenant with the mountain required absolute commitment from every generation. Doubt was a luxury they couldn't afford. The mountain was listening, always listening. The real records weren't kept in the company office where state inspectors might find them. They lived in Ezra's private study, locked behind a mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather. 3 leather-bound volumes chronicled 6 decades of carefully orchestrated sacrifice, written in a cipher that mixed mining terminology with symbols older than coal itself. July 14, 1896. Mountain restless after 3-month dormancy. Feeding required before autumn push. Selected William McBride, age 28, 3 children. Shaft collapse, timber failure. Mountain satisfied until harvest. The entries read like a corporate ledger, each human life reduced to operational notes. Ezra ran his finger down the pages, tracing the evolution of his family's method. His grandfather had been crude, relying on obvious accidents and natural disasters. His father had refined the process, learning to read the mountain's moods and time the offerings to maximize productivity. But Ezra had elevated sacrifice to an art form. The mountain spoke to those who listened. It whispered through rock shifts and gas seeps, through the behavior of rats in the tunnels and the color of water that seeped from certain formations. Over 16 years of leadership, Ezra had decoded this language, learning to predict when the mountain's hunger would peak and which type of offering would best satisfy its appetite. Young men for major excavations, fathers for tunnel expansions, troublemakers for any operation that threatened the family's control. Thomas Garrett's death had bought them 6 months of stability, but Ezra could already feel the mountain stirring again. Production quotas were increasing as coal demand soared. The company was planning to open 2 new shafts before winter, operations that would require significant offerings to ensure success. A knock at the study door interrupted his planning. Caleb entered without waiting for permission, his face flushed with the kind of anger that had been building since Thomas's memorial service. "We need to talk," Caleb said, closing the door behind him. "About what?" "About this." Caleb pulled a folded paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk. It was a letter from the State Mining Commission, announcing a safety inspection scheduled for August 15th. "They're sending investigators to review our accident reports." Ezra studied the letter carefully. Official inspections were rare in remote camps like Blackrock, usually triggered by complaints or unusual patterns in death reports. Someone had been talking to authorities outside the hollow. "Any idea who might have contacted them?" Ezra asked. "Does it matter? They're coming either way." "It matters because we need to know how much they know and who else they might be talking to." Caleb sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk. For the first time, Ezra noticed how much his brother had aged in recent months. Gray touched his temples, and lines creased his face like someone carrying too many sleepless nights. "Maybe this is for the best," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe it's time to find a different way." "Different way to what?" "Different way to run this camp without feeding people to the mountain like some kind of pagan god." The blasphemy hung between them like smoke from a poorly ventilated shaft. Ezra closed the ledger and locked it back in the drawer, his movements deliberate and calm. "You think this is about religion?" Ezra asked. "You think I enjoy choosing who lives and dies? I think you've convinced yourself that murder is management, and you've been doing it so long you can't see how crazy it sounds to normal people. Normal people don't pull 800 tons of coal from unstable mountain every month. Normal people don't keep 43 families fed and housed in the middle of nowhere. Normal people don't carry responsibility for an operation that could collapse and kill everyone if the mountain decides to take its payment all at once." Ezra opened the desk drawer again and pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1918. The headline read, "Cave-in claims 37 at Morgantown Mine." Below it, another clipping from 1920. "Gas explosion kills 42 in Harlan County." Those operations didn't have a covenant with the mountain, Ezra said. They took what they wanted without offering anything in return. So the mountain took everything. Caleb stared at the clippings, his jaw working as he fought internal battles Ezra couldn't see. Finally, he looked up with eyes that held equal parts fear and determination. "The investigators will find evidence if they look hard enough. Shortened fuses, weakened timbers, too many accidents with too convenient timing. What happens to our families when they do? They won't find anything because there's nothing to find. Accidents happen in coal mines, Caleb. The mountain doesn't leave evidence." But even as he spoke the words, Ezra felt uncertainty gnawing at his confidence. Modern investigators had modern tools, scientific methods that might reveal patterns his grandfather never had to worry about. The covenant that protected Blackrock might not be enough to shield the family from outside scrutiny. Margaret Whitman had been asking too many questions for someone who was supposed to be teaching basic arithmetic and reading. The children noticed first: bright, curious minds that absorbed information faster than their parents realized. 8-year-old Emma Cole had mentioned her teacher's interest in mining accidents during a family dinner, prompting her father, James, to pay attention to conversations he'd previously ignored. The schoolhouse sat at the hollow's eastern edge, positioned to catch morning light through windows that also provided clear views of the mine entrance and the company office. From her desk, Margaret could observe the daily rhythms that governed Blackrock: shift changes, supply deliveries, and the subtle signals that preceded what locals called mountain weather. Periods when the mine operated under heightened tension. She'd been documenting patterns in a journal that would have terrified the Blevins family if they'd known it existed. Dates of accidents cross-referenced with production schedules. Names of victims organized by family connections and union sympathies. Details about rescue operations that seemed strangely well organized, as if certain emergencies had been anticipated. "Miss Whitman?" Emma Cole raised her hand during the afternoon lesson on Kentucky geography. "My daddy says the mountain talks to Mr. Blevins. Is that true?" Margaret paused in her chalk, work on the blackboard, feeling 23 pairs of young eyes watching her response. Children in coal camps learned early to navigate adult secrets, to sense which topics were safe and which could bring consequences to their families. "Mountains don't talk the way people do," Margaret replied carefully. But experienced miners learn to read signs, sounds and movements that help them work safely. "But why does the mountain only talk to the Blevins family?" asked Samuel Murphy, whose father had died the previous winter in what officials ruled a gas explosion. The question hung in the classroom air like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. Margaret felt the weight of young minds trying to understand their world through fragments of overheard conversation and carefully hidden fear. "Who told you the mountain talks to the Blevins family?" she asked. "Everybody knows," Emma said, her voice dropping to the whisper children use for dangerous truths. "Mama says the mountain gets hungry, and Mr. Ezra feeds it so it doesn't eat everybody at once." Margaret set down her chalk and turned to face the class. These children were growing up in a community where ritualized murder was explained as natural law, where their fathers' deaths were justified as necessary sacrifice. How could she teach them to think clearly when their entire reality was built on lies? "What else do people say about Mr. Blevins and the mountain?" she asked. The children exchanged glances, internal negotiations about how much truth was safe to speak aloud. Finally, 10-year-old Robert Hutchins, whose uncle had died 2 years earlier, raised his hand. "They say he chooses who the mountain takes. Papa says some men get sent to dangerous places right before accidents happen." Margaret felt her chest tighten. Children weren't supposed to understand murder, but in Blackrock Hollow, the line between adult secrets and childhood knowledge had been erased by decades of normalized violence. "What do you think about that?" she asked. "I think it's scary," Emma whispered. "I think it's not fair," added Samuel. "I think we're not supposed to talk about it," said Robert, glancing nervously toward the window that faced the company office. Margaret followed his gaze and saw Caleb Blevins standing outside her schoolhouse, close enough to have heard their conversation if the windows were open. Their eyes met through the glass, and she saw something that surprised her. Not anger or threat, but exhaustion and shame. That afternoon, after the children had gone home, Caleb knocked on the schoolhouse door. Margaret had been expecting him, dreading the conversation, but knowing it couldn't be avoided. "Afternoon, Miss Whitman," Caleb said, removing his hat as he entered. "Wondered if I might have a word." Of course. He studied the classroom. Children's drawings pinned to walls, arithmetic problems chalked on the board, textbooks stacked neatly on desks. Normal things in a place that had learned to treat abnormality as routine. "Children say interesting things when they feel safe," Caleb said finally. "They do. Sometimes they repeat things they shouldn't have heard, things that could cause problems for their families." Margaret recognized the careful phrasing of a man walking on dangerous ground. Caleb wasn't making threats. He was issuing warnings, possibly even seeking alliance. "What kind of problems?" she asked. "The kind that comes when people start believing stories instead of focusing on facts. Coal mining is dangerous work, Miss Whitman. Always has been. When people start looking for patterns or conspiracies, they stop paying attention to real safety concerns." "And what are the real safety concerns?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on a child's drawing of the mine entrance surrounded by stick figures of miners heading to work. "Sometimes the real danger isn't the mountain," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's the people who think they understand the mountain better than they actually do." The investigators arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, bringing with them instruments and attitudes that Blackrock Hollow had never seen. State mining engineer Harrison Webb carried a leather satchel filled with measuring devices, chemical testing kits, and forms designed to quantify things the mountain had never been asked to explain. Ezra met them at the camp entrance with the practiced courtesy of a man accustomed to managing unwelcome visitors. Webb's assistant, a young geologist named David Park, immediately began photographing the mine entrance and taking notes that would later become evidence in proceedings the Blevins family couldn't control. "Gentlemen, welcome to Blackrock. I understand you're here to review our safety protocols." Webb consulted a folder thick with correspondence and official reports. "We've had inquiries about your accident rates, Mr. Blevins. 7 fatalities in the past 18 months seems elevated for an operation this size." "Mountain mining carries inherent risks," Ezra replied. "Our men understand that when they take employment here. Understanding risk and accepting unnecessary death are different things," Webb said. "We'll need to inspect your shafts, review your blast procedures, and examine the sites where these accidents occurred." As they walked toward the mine entrance, Ezra felt the mountain's attention like heat on his skin. The morning mist hung heavier than usual, and water dripped from rock formations that normally stayed dry. The mountain was agitated by outside presence, uncomfortable with scrutiny from people who didn't understand the covenant. Park stopped at the spot where Thomas Garrett had died, pulling instruments from his bag and taking measurements that meant nothing to the miners watching from a safe distance. He scraped samples from the collapsed timbers, noting the angle of the roof fall and the distribution of debris. "Interesting," Park said to Webb. "The support beam failed at exactly its weakest point, but the failure pattern suggests impact rather than gradual stress." "Impact from what?" "Probably the blast, but the timing would have to be extremely precise to cause this specific type of collapse." Webb made notes while Park continued his examination. Ezra stood nearby, projecting calm authority while calculating how much these men might discover and what it would cost to ensure their silence. "Mr. Blevins," Webb said, "we'll need to speak with the men who were present during Mr. Garrett's accident." "Of course, though I should mention that coal miners aren't always reliable witnesses. The work attracts men who prefer action to analysis. We'll make our own judgments about reliability." The interviews began that afternoon in the company office, with Webb and Park questioning miners one by one about accidents they'd witnessed or survived. Most of the men provided exactly the responses Ezra had expected. Careful, neutral accounts that emphasized the dangerous nature of mining work while avoiding speculation about cause or responsibility. But Jimmy Hutchins, whose brother had died in the gas explosion, proved more talkative than anticipated. "Way I see it," Hutchins told the investigators, "accidents got a pattern to them. They happen right when we're about to hit new seams, right before big shipments go out. Like the mountain knows when to take its payment." "Payment for what?" Webb asked. "For the coal. Mountain don't give up its treasures for free." "You mean natural geological instability?" "I mean the mountain gets fed regular, or it takes everything at once." Park and Webb exchanged glances. They'd interviewed hundreds of miners in dozens of camps, but they'd never heard anyone describe industrial accidents as feeding rituals. "Who feeds the mountain?" Webb asked. Jimmy hesitated, realizing he'd already said too much. The company office felt smaller suddenly, its walls pressing closer with the weight of secrets that had protected and destroyed his family for decades. "Nobody feeds it," he said finally. "That's just talk. Superstition stuff." But the damage was done. Webb spent the rest of the afternoon asking different questions, probing for connections between accidents and decision-makers, between timing and responsibility. By evening, he'd filled 3 notebooks with observations that would keep state investigators busy for months. That night, Ezra sat in his study reviewing the day's events and calculating their implications. The investigators had found evidence, not enough to prove deliberate murder, but sufficient to justify extended investigation. More people would come asking more questions. The federal government might get involved. The covenant that had protected his family for 60 years was being threatened by men who believed in scientific method more than mountain spirits. Through his window, he could see lights burning late in several miners' homes. Families having conversations about how much truth was safe to tell outsiders. People weighing loyalty to the company against fear for their own survival. The mountain was growing hungry again. The 3rd week of August brought decisions that would haunt Blackrock Hollow for generations. Webb and Park had extended their investigation, requesting additional records and scheduling follow-up interviews with family members of accident victims. Their presence was disrupting the careful balance of fear and cooperation that kept the camp functioning. Sarah Garrett found herself at the center of this disruption when Webb asked to speak with her about Thomas's death. She agreed to meet at the schoolhouse, neutral ground where company influence might carry less weight. Margaret Whitman offered to attend as a witness, her presence providing something Sarah hadn't realized she needed, validation that her questions were reasonable. "Mrs. Garrett," Webb said, consulting his notes. "Your husband was an experienced miner, correct? 16 years underground. Started when he was barely old enough to work legally. In your opinion, would he have positioned himself in a dangerous location during a blast?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Around her, the community was watching how she answered, whether she maintained the fiction that had protected everyone or broke ranks to speak uncomfortable truths. "Thomas was careful," she said finally. "Maybe too careful sometimes. He'd check his equipment twice, test his footing before moving into new areas. The other men used to tease him about it. So it would be unusual for him to be caught in a roof collapse? It would be impossible unless something went wrong with the timing." Margaret felt the weight of Sarah's words settling over the room like dust from a distant explosion. This was the moment when Blackrock's wall of silence would either hold or crumble. Webb made notes while Park sketched the blast site layout based on Sarah's description of Thomas's normal procedures. Their investigation was building toward conclusions that would require official action, state intervention, possibly federal charges against the Blevins family. One final question, Mrs. Garrett. Do you believe your husband's death was accidental? The silence stretched until Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. Sarah's eyes moved to the window, where several miners' wives had gathered outside, their faces showing the kind of tension that comes from watching someone else decide everyone's fate. I believe my husband died doing dangerous work, Sarah said carefully. I believe accidents happen in coal mines, and I believe Thomas wouldn't want his death to cause trouble for the families who still need to earn their living here. Webb closed his notebook. The diplomatic non-answer told him everything he needed to know about fear levels in Blackrock Hollow, but it provided no legal ammunition for prosecuting the Blevins family. That afternoon, word spread through the camp that Webb and Park would be leaving the following morning. Their investigation had found evidence of unsafe practices and regulatory violations, but nothing sufficient to prove deliberate homicide. The Blevins family would face fines and increased oversight, but no criminal charges. The news hit the community like a roof collapse in slow motion. Some felt relief that their employers would escape serious consequences. Unemployment was worse than working for murderers. Others felt betrayed by a system that could document patterns of suspicious death without providing justice for the victims. Margaret gathered her courage and knocked on Ezra Blevins' door that evening. When he answered, she saw a man who looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of maintaining control through violence and fear. Miss Whitman, this is unexpected. I wanted to discuss my students' education, she said. Ezra invited her into his parlor, a formal room filled with furniture that had belonged to 3 generations of men who'd ruled through carefully administered terror. She noticed a family portrait on the mantel. 4 generations of Blevins men, including a young boy who would grow up to inherit his family's bloody legacy. The children are bright, Margaret said. They ask intelligent questions and make connections between things they observe. That's exactly what good education should encourage. Children should focus on practical skills that will help them support their families, like knowing how to recognize patterns, how to identify cause and effect relationships, how to speak up when they see something wrong. Ezra studied her face, reading the challenge beneath her educational rhetoric. This conversation wasn't about lesson plans or curriculum standards. Children who ask too many questions sometimes learn things that make their lives more difficult, he said quietly. And children who don't ask questions sometimes grow up accepting situations that shouldn't be accepted. They sat in silence while the implications of their conversation settled between them. Margaret was threatening the foundation of the Blevins family's control, the community's willingness to sacrifice truth for survival. Miss Whitman, Ezra said finally, your teaching contract expires at the end of this term. I imagine Lexington has opportunities for someone with your qualifications. I imagine it does. It would be unfortunate if budget constraints forced us to eliminate the teaching position entirely. 43 families depend on company employment here. Sometimes individual sacrifice serves the greater good. Margaret understood the mathematics of his threat, her silence in exchange for the children's continued education. Speak out about the murders, and the entire community would lose its school. Accept complicity, and the killing would continue under cover of her educational authority. What would you do when staying silent protects some innocence while condemning others? Margaret faced the same impossible choice that had paralyzed Blackrock Hollow for decades. She left without giving Ezra an answer, but her departure felt like surrender. September brought the kind of mountain weather that made old-timers nervous. Heavy mist that lingered past noon. Water seepage in shafts that had been dry for years. And strange sounds that echoed through tunnels when no one was working. The mountain was stirring, restless after months of outside attention and delayed offerings. Ezra felt the pressure building like gas accumulating in a poorly ventilated shaft. The investigators had disrupted his schedule, forcing him to postpone necessary sacrifices while maintaining the appearance of improved safety standards. But the mountain's hunger couldn't be ignored indefinitely, and production quotas continued to increase as war demand for coal reached unprecedented levels. The ledger entries from this period showed a man wrestling with impossible mathematics. September 3, 1922, mountain restless 14 weeks since last feeding. Production down 12%. New safety inspector arrives monthly. Federal oversight increasing. Offering required, but exposure risk extreme. Caleb had grown more resistant to the family's methods, openly questioning decisions that previous generations had accepted without debate. He'd started attending the evening prayer meetings that Reverend Hartwell held for miners' families, seeking spiritual guidance for problems that had no theological solutions. "Brother," Caleb said, entering Ezra's study without knocking, "we need to discuss the future of this operation." "What about it?" "We need to find a way to run this mine without killing people." Ezra closed the ledger and studied his brother's face. Caleb had lost weight over the summer, his cheeks hollow and his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. The moral weight of their family's covenant was crushing him in ways that surprised Ezra, who'd never experienced doubt about the necessity of sacrifice. "You think we can just stop?" Ezra asked. "You think the mountain will accept that?" "I think the mountain is a pile of rock and coal, and we've been using superstition to justify murder for 60 years. The blasphemy hit Ezra like a physical blow. Caleb wasn't just questioning their methods. He was denying the spiritual reality that gave those methods meaning. "You want to see what happens when we ignore the mountain's hunger?" Ezra asked. He pulled a newspaper clipping from his desk drawer, headlines from other mining operations that had suffered catastrophic disasters. 47 dead in West Virginia last month. Gas explosion that could have been prevented with proper offerings. Gas explosion that could have been prevented with proper ventilation and safety equipment. Equipment doesn't appease spiritual forces. Equipment prevents industrial accidents. They stared at each other across a philosophical divide that had been widening for months. Ezra saw a brother who'd lost faith in the family's sacred responsibility. Caleb saw a brother who'd been corrupted by power and convinced himself that murder was mercy. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ezra asked. "I'm proposing we implement real safety measures, proper ventilation systems, reinforced support structures, modern blast protocols. We invest in protecting our workers instead of choosing which ones to sacrifice. And when the mountain takes its payment anyway? When we have a cave-in that kills 30 men instead of one? What do we tell their families then?" Caleb pulled a chair close to the desk and sat down heavily, the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. "We tell them we did everything we could to prevent it," he said quietly. "We tell them their husbands died in spite of our efforts, not because of them." Ezra opened the ledger again and turned to the final entry he'd planned to make. October 1st, 1922, mountain hunger critical. Brother Caleb selected for harvest offering. Tunnel collapse, shaft 9. Family line maintained through necessity. Caleb couldn't read the upside-down text, but he recognized his own name among the coded symbols. For the first time in their confrontation, Real fear crossed his face. "You're planning to kill me," he said. "I'm planning to save this operation and everyone who depends on it. By murdering your own brother. By making the sacrifice the mountain demands from our family." Caleb stood up slowly, his hand moving unconsciously toward the door. "And after me? When the mountain gets hungry again? Who's next?" Ezra didn't answer because they both knew. The mountain's hunger was infinite, and the Blevins family line would continue feeding it until there was no one left to maintain the covenant. The decision to eliminate Caleb required more planning than previous sacrifices. Brothers don't die in convenient accidents without raising questions from families who've learned to watch for patterns. Ezra needed an event spectacular enough to seem random, while precise enough to remove his primary threat to the mountain's covenant. He spent 3 sleepless nights designing the perfect disaster. A controlled cave-in in Shaft 9 that would appear to result from geological instability while targeting a specific individual who'd grown too dangerous to preserve. The timing would coincide with the autumn push for increased production, providing cover for the accident and justification for enhanced safety measures afterward. October 1st dawned with the kind of crisp mountain air that made miners optimistic about the day's work. Caleb led the morning shift into Shaft 9, unaware that his brother had spent the previous evening weakening support structures and calculating blast angles that would seal his fate. But the mountain had other plans. At 8:47 a.m., while Caleb's crew worked the deepest sections of Shaft 9, a natural gas pocket ruptured in Shaft 6, sending flames racing through ventilation tunnels that connected the entire mine system. The explosion was larger than anything Ezra had anticipated, more violent than any sacrifice he'd ever orchestrated. 14 men died in the first 30 seconds. Another 6 were trapped in collapsing tunnels that sealed them away from rescue teams. The mountain's hunger, delayed too long by outside interference, had taken its payment with compound interest. Ezra stood at the mine entrance as rescue workers pulled bodies from the wreckage, counting faces and calculating losses that exceeded even his worst predictions. The controlled sacrifice he'd planned for his brother had become a holocaust that consumed 1/3 of his workforce. Caleb emerged from Shaft 9 covered in soot but breathing, his crew having been far enough from the gas pocket to escape the initial explosion. He looked at his brother across 50 yards of smoke and chaos, understanding finally that proximity to death had been deliberately arranged. 20 dead, Caleb said when they met at the company office. 20 families destroyed because you thought you could manage the mountain like a business ledger. The mountain was hungry, Ezra replied, though his voice carried less certainty than usual. This would have been worse if we hadn't been making regular offerings. This happened because you've been playing God for so long, you forgot you're not actually divine. Emergency responders from 3 counties had converged on Blackrock Hollow, bringing equipment and expertise that made the previous investigation look casual. Federal inspectors arrived by afternoon, accompanied by prosecutors who understood the difference between negligent homicide and industrial accidents. Margaret Whitman stood in her schoolhouse doorway, watching rescue workers carry covered stretchers toward waiting ambulances. 15 of her students had lost fathers in the explosion, children who would now grow up in a community where the pretense of safety had been stripped away by undeniable reality. The mountain had spoken louder than anyone expected. The federal investigation that followed the October 1st explosion differed fundamentally from Webb's earlier inquiry. 20 deaths triggered mandatory reviews that couldn't be deflected through local influence or carefully managed testimony. FBI investigators arrived with warrants and subpoena power, authority that superseded company control. Special Agent Catherine Morrison had built her career prosecuting organized crime in Chicago, experience that prepared her to recognize patterns of systematic violence disguised as legitimate business operations. She'd studied the Blackrock files during the train journey from Louisville, noting statistical anomalies that suggested deliberate causation rather than random misfortune. "Mr. Blevins," Morrison said during her first interview with Ezra, "your mine has experienced 43 fatalities over the past 16 years. The state average for operations this size is 12 deaths over the same period. How do you explain the discrepancy?" "Dangerous work in challenging geological conditions," Ezra replied, using the standard explanation that had protected his family for decades. "Dangerous work that seems to claim specific types of workers at statistically significant moments?" Morrison had done her research. Union organizers died during labor disputes. Safety complainants died shortly after filing reports. Men who asked too many questions died in accidents that silenced their inquiries. "I'm not sure I understand your implication." "I'm implying that someone has been using industrial accidents to eliminate problems and intimidate workers. I'm asking whether you know who that someone might be." The questions continued for 6 hours, with Morrison probing every aspect of the Blevins family's operation while federal investigators examined physical evidence from 60 years of suspicious deaths. Modern forensic techniques revealed details that previous generations of investigators couldn't detect. Blast patterns that suggested intentional timing, structural failures that showed deliberate weakening, gas accumulations that appeared to result from blocked ventilation rather than natural occurrence. Meanwhile, Caleb had begun talking to anyone who would listen. The October 1st explosion had shattered his loyalty to family traditions, replacing it with desperate need to prevent future massacres. "My grandfather started it in 1878, he told Morrison during a secret meeting at Margaret Whitman's schoolhouse. "One man dead every few months to keep the mountains satisfied. My father continued it, and my brother perfected it. 60 years of murder disguised as industrial accidents." Morrison recorded the confession while Margaret served as witness, her presence providing legal protection for testimony that could destroy the Blevins family forever. "Why are you telling me this now?" Morrison asked. "Because 20 good men died for nothing. Because my brother was planning to kill me next. Because I can't watch this continue and call myself a human being." The evidence Caleb provided unlocked patterns that investigators had suspected but couldn't prove. Family ledgers detailing planned sacrifices, engineering reports that identified deliberately created hazards, financial records showing payments to company engineers who modified safety equipment according to Ezra's specifications. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: the mountain itself. Federal geologists examining the explosion site discovered artificial modifications to natural gas formations, deliberate attempts to create unstable pockets that could be triggered through controlled blasts. The October 1st disaster hadn't been a random eruption. It had been the result of Ezra's attempts to engineer a smaller, more targeted explosion that had exceeded his ability to control. "Your brother tried to create an accident that would kill you specifically," Morrison explained to Caleb. "Instead, he caused a chain reaction that killed 20 men and destroyed half the mine. The mountain had rejected its covenant keeper. November brought the first snows to Blackrock Hollow, and with them a community reckoning that cut deeper than federal investigations. Families who'd lost breadwinners in the October explosion faced winter without income, while survivors wrestled with questions about their own complicity in decades of systematic murder. The company store extended credit to widows and orphans, But charity couldn't erase the moral weight of benefiting from a system built on sacrifice. Every meal purchased with company money, every coal-heated home, every paycheck earned in Blevins-owned mines carried the taste of blood that couldn't be washed away. Sarah Garrett found herself at the center of these moral calculations when federal prosecutors offered her immunity in exchange for testimony about Thomas's death. The opportunity to see his killers punished came with the cost of destroying a community that had no economic alternatives to the Blevins family's employment. "What good does justice do if it leaves 40 families starving?" she asked Margaret Whitman during one of their evening conversations in the schoolhouse. "What good does survival do if it requires accepting murder as normal business practice?" Margaret replied. They were both right, and both trapped by circumstances that offered no clean solutions. Federal justice would destroy the community economically while failing to resurrect the dead. Local silence would preserve jobs while permitting future murders. The children caught in this moral crossfire asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Emma Cole wanted to know why her father had to keep working for people who killed other fathers. Samuel Murphy wondered if his father would still be alive if someone had spoken up sooner. Robert Hutchins asked whether staying quiet about murder made a person an accessory to future crimes. Margaret tried to provide guidance through literature and history, teaching her students about communities that had faced similar choices between survival and principle. But textbook examples felt inadequate when addressing the immediate reality of families choosing between complicity and destitution. The federal case against Ezra Blevins was building momentum that couldn't be stopped through local pressure or political influence. Morrison had documented 43 murders spanning 6 decades, supported by physical evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own planning documents. The death penalty was almost certain if prosecutors could prove premeditation across multiple killings. But Ezra had one final card to play. On November 28th, he called a meeting of all remaining camp residents in the chapel that had witnessed 60 years of his family's rule. The building was packed beyond capacity, with families standing in aisles and crowding near windows to hear words that would determine their futures. "Friends," Ezra began, his voice carrying across faces that had learned to fear him more than the mountain itself. "The federal government has decided to destroy our community. They want to put me in prison for protecting you from geological forces they don't understand." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Not agreement, but the nervous energy of people listening to a desperate man with power to harm them. "If I'm convicted, this mine closes permanently. Every job disappears. Every family loses their home. The children lose their school, and you lose everything you've built here." The threat was clear. Maintain the wall of silence that had protected him for decades, or watch their community die along with his conviction. "But I'm prepared to offer an alternative," Ezra continued. "Voluntary relocation assistance for any family that wants to leave. Full compensation for lost property. Help finding employment in other coal operations. All I ask in return is that you remember the good times we shared and the prosperity this mine brought to your families." It was bribery disguised as generosity, an attempt to purchase silence through voluntary exodus rather than economic coercion. Some families would take the offer and disappear, removing potential witnesses from the federal case. Others would stay and maintain their silence, protecting their remaining livelihood. But the mountain had its own opinion about broken covenants. The final collapse came on December 7th, 1922, exactly 60 days after the explosion that had killed 20 men and shattered Ezra's belief in his ability to control geological forces through human sacrifice. The mountain's rejection of its covenant keeper was absolute and devastating. Federal investigators had been examining the mine's structural integrity as part of their case preparation when seismic instruments detected unusual activity in the deepest shafts. Dr. Patricia Coleman, the government geologist leading the technical investigation, had never seen readings that suggested such rapid deterioration in rock formations. "It's as if the entire mountain is settling," she told Agent Morrison. "Support structures that should last decades are failing simultaneously. The whole mine system is becoming unstable." At 3:41 p.m., while federal agents conducted interviews in the company office and families prepared for another uncertain night, the mountain delivered its final judgment. The main support structure of Shaft 6 collapsed without warning, creating a chain reaction that brought down every tunnel Ezra's family had carved over 60 years. The sound was unlike anything Blackrock Hollow had ever heard. Not the sharp crack of individual timber failures or the rumbling crash of localized cave-ins, but a deep, sustained groan that seemed to come from the mountain's core. Windows shattered in buildings half a mile from the mine entrance. The ground rolled like water, and trees that had stood for centuries toppled as their roots lost purchase in shifting earth. When the dust settled, the mine entrance had vanished beneath 10,000 tons of rock that would never be moved. 60 years of tunnels and shafts were sealed permanently, along with the bodies of anyone who might have been underground when the mountain decided it had surrendered enough of its treasures to the Blevins family. Ezra stood in the ruins of his empire, staring at granite walls that had closed like a tomb over everything his grandfather had built. The federal investigators gathered around him, their equipment registering aftershocks that would continue for weeks as the mountain adjusted to its new configuration. "Unprecedented geological event," Dr. Coleman reported to her superiors. "Complete structural failure across multiple shaft systems. The entire mining operation is permanently inaccessible." Agent Morrison watched Ezra's face as the reality of total loss settled over him. The man who'd believed he could control natural forces through human sacrifice had been judged by the mountain itself. His covenant was broken, his empire was buried, and his family's 60-year dynasty was ending in absolute failure. But the legal case against him would continue, even without access to the physical crime scenes. The evidence Caleb had provided, combined with testimony from survivors and federal investigation findings, was sufficient to prove systematic murder regardless of whether the bodies could be recovered. Margaret Whitman gathered her students in the schoolhouse that evening, looking out at a community that would never be the same. The mine's destruction had eliminated both the source of their livelihood and the instrument of their oppression. They were free from the Blevins family's control, but freedom came with the price of economic devastation. "What happens now?" Emma Cole asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of adult concerns. "Now we decide what kind of community we want to build," Margaret replied, though she wasn't certain there would be a community to rebuild. The mountain had spoken its final word about covenants sealed in human blood. Spring came late to Blackrock Hollow in 1923, as if the mountain's judgment had altered the region's seasonal rhythms. Federal prosecutors had moved their case to Louisville after the mine's collapse made local proceedings impossible. But the legal machinery ground forward with relentless precision. Ezra Blevins faced 43 counts of first-degree murder, supported by evidence that spanned 6 decades of documented killing. His trial became a sensation in Kentucky newspapers, which couldn't decide whether to frame the story as corporate malfeasance or ritualistic insanity. The truth encompassed both, creating a legal precedent for prosecuting systematic violence disguised as industrial accidents. Caleb testified as the prosecution's primary witness, his detailed knowledge of family methods providing evidence that no external investigation could have uncovered. The emotional cost of betraying his bloodline was visible in every answer he gave, but the moral weight of protecting future victims outweighed genetic loyalty. "The ledgers document everything," Caleb told the packed courtroom. "Names, dates, methods, even financial calculations about how much each death would save the company in wages and benefits." Margaret Whitman testified about the children's understanding of their father's danger, the way young minds had been shaped by growing up in a community where murder was explained as natural law. Her testimony helped prosecutors establish the broader impact of the Blevins family's crimes beyond the immediate victims. Children as young as 8 could predict which minors were most likely to die in accidents, she explained. They'd learned to read the signs that indicated someone had been selected for sacrifice. The defense strategy centered on portraying Ezra as a man driven to desperation by impossible economic pressures and geological realities beyond his control. His attorneys argued that Appalachian mining communities operated under different rules than urban society, that survival sometimes required decisions that seemed irrational to outsiders. "My client believed he was protecting his community through the only means available to him," defense attorney Marcus Delano told the jury. "Right or wrong, his actions were motivated by responsibility to the 43 families whose survival depended on the mine's success." But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Federal investigators had documented the engineering modifications that made accidents possible, the financial incentives that made them profitable, and the family tradition that made them inevitable. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Ezra Blevins was sentenced to death, becoming the first person in Kentucky history to face execution for using industrial accidents as murder weapons. His execution was scheduled for October 1st, 1923, exactly 1 year after the explosion that had ended his family's control over Blackrock Hollow. Meanwhile, the community he'd ruled faced impossible choices about their future. The mine's closure had eliminated every source of employment in a region with few economic alternatives. Families began leaving for cities like Louisville and Cincinnati, carrying skills that had no application outside the coal industry. Sarah Garrett was among the first to relocate, using federal compensation money to start fresh in a place where her husband's death wouldn't follow her like a shadow. She left Blackrock without looking back, determined to raise her children in communities where industrial accidents were truly accidental. "Some places are too stained to clean," she told Margaret before departing. "Sometimes the only healing comes from starting somewhere new." Margaret faced her own crossroads as families departed and student enrollment dropped below viable levels. The state education department offered her positions in established districts where her skills would be appreciated and her salary would arrive regularly. But leaving felt like abandoning the children who needed stability most during their community's dissolution. She chose to stay until the last family departed, providing education and emotional support through the long process of community death. Her final semester at Blackrock Hollow included only 7 students, children whose families couldn't afford relocation or had nowhere else to go. The Hollow grew quieter each month as houses emptied and businesses closed. The company store shuttered when there were no longer enough customers to justify operation. The chapel held its final service in September 1923, with Reverend Hartwell offering prayers for the dead and blessings for the living who were starting over somewhere else. By winter, only 5 families remained in Blackrock Hollow, caretakers of a community that had died along with the man who'd ruled it through terror. The execution of Ezra Blevins on October 1st, 1923, marked the official end of a dynasty that had lasted 3 generations. He died without confession, maintaining to the end that his actions had protected more lives than they'd claimed. The mountain's judgment, he insisted, had proven his covenant's failure rather than its falsehood. Caleb watched his brother die from the witness section, carrying guilt that would follow him for the rest of his life. After the execution, he disappeared from public record, possibly changing his name or moving far enough away that his connection to the Blevins family couldn't follow him. Margaret Whitman finally left Blackrock Hollow in November 1923, accepting a teaching position in Frankfurt, where her experiences in the coal camps informed her work with displaced mining families. She wrote extensively about the psychological impact of systematic violence on children, becoming an early advocate for trauma-informed education. Her final report to the State Education Department included recommendations that would influence policy for decades. Communities that normalize violence create children who cannot distinguish between necessary authority and illegitimate oppression. Educational intervention must address these distortions before they become permanent. The physical remnants of Blackrock Hollow deteriorated rapidly once human maintenance ceased. Buildings that had housed 3 generations of mining families became shelters for wildlife as roofs collapsed and walls surrendered to weather. The company store's foundation still supported walls in 1928, but by 1935, even those had crumbled. Nature reclaimed the hollow with surprising gentleness, as if the mountain was healing wounds inflicted by decades of industrial exploitation. Trees grew through abandoned foundations, and wildflowers bloomed in yards where children had once played under the shadow of systematic murder. But the mountain kept its secrets poorly. Hikers exploring the region in the 1960s reported strange phenomena around the sealed mine entrance. Sounds that resembled human voices echoing from deep underground, ground that felt warm to the touch even during winter, and a persistent smell of sulfur that intensified during certain weather conditions. Local folklore developed around these reports, stories that mixed geological speculation with supernatural explanation. Some claimed the mountain was haunted by miners who died in the final collapse. Others suggested that Ezra's covenant with dark forces had left permanent scars on the landscape itself. More disturbing were the documented cases of illness among people who spent extended time in the former coal camp area. Between 1970 and 1985, 11 hikers developed respiratory problems after overnight camping near Blackrock Hollow. 3 suffered mental health episodes that required hospitalization. The State Forestry Service eventually restricted access to the area, citing unstable ground conditions and potential contamination from abandoned mining equipment. Signs posted around the former camp boundaries warned visitors about geological hazards and environmental contamination. But local residents knew the real danger was harder to quantify. Margaret Whitman returned to Blackrock Hollow in 1978, 55 years after leaving to begin her career in Frankfurt. She was retired by then, but drawn back by curiosity about what had become of the place that had shaped her understanding of human nature. She found wilderness where a community had once struggled to survive. The schoolhouse foundation was still visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves, and she could trace the outline of the chapel where 3 generations of Blevins men had justified murder through religious ceremony. Standing at the sealed mine entrance, Margaret felt the weight of all the lives that had been sacrificed to feed an appetite that existed only in the imagination of men who'd confused power with divinity. 43 names carved into her memory, children who'd grown up believing their fathers' deaths were natural and necessary. The mountain offered no answers, only silence that felt heavy with accumulated secrets.